The year was 1888. The Montana sky was a vast, unforgiving canvas of blue, stretched tight over a land that gave no quarter. On the Blackwood Ranch, silence was the primary crop, and it grew in abundance, choking out the wild roses that once climbed the porch railings. Silas Blackwood moved through this silence as if it were his native element. Grief was a second skin he wore, tailored by the loss of his wife and son 2 winters past, a sickness that had stolen their breath and left him with only the harsh inhale and exhale of his own lonely existence. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his fences, to the sweat on his brow and the ache in his back. He worked from before the sun bled over the eastern plains until long after it sank, a bruised purple, behind the jagged teeth of the mountains. He worked not for profit, or for a future, but to exhaust his body into a state where his mind had no energy left to remember. It was a failing strategy. The ghosts were tireless. They owned the quiet corners of the house, the empty chair at the table, the small, unused cot in the spare room. It was this haunting that drove him to town, not for companionship, but for a solution. He needed a pair of hands. A presence that was not a memory. The man he met by the livery was weasel-thin and smelled of cheap whiskey and desperation. He spoke of a woman. An arrangement. She's healthy. Strong back, the man had said, his eyes darting away from Silas's steady gaze. Quiet. Won't be no trouble. Then came the caveat, the detail that made the transaction feel like a final, damning verdict on his own withered life. Guaranteed barren. And she keeps her face covered. Silas looked at the figure sitting on the wagon bench, a slight woman shrouded in a thick, dun-colored shawl that obscured her entirely, leaving only the suggestion of a person beneath. He felt nothing. Not pity, not curiosity. Only a bleak, hollow pragmatism. He took $5 silver from his pocket, coins worn smooth with use, and dropped them into the weasel's waiting palm. The clink of the metal was the sound of a door shutting. He did not ask her name. He did not ask to see her face. He simply gestured to his own wagon. She moved without a word, her steps light but sure, and climbed aboard. The transaction was complete. He had purchased a housekeeper. A ghost to chase away the others. The journey back to the ranch was a study in stillness. Silas did not speak, his attention fixed on the rutted track ahead, his hands firm on the reins. Beside him, the veiled woman sat as motionless as a statue carved from sorrow. She did not fidget or shift. The dust kicked up by the horses settled on her shawl, a fine grey powder that she did not brush away. When they arrived, the sun was low, casting long, skeletal shadows from the fence posts. The house looked hunched and tired, its windows like vacant eyes. "The kitchen is there," Silas said, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. "Your room is at the back. There is food in the larder." He did not help her down. He did not invite her in. He turned and walked toward the barn, toward the familiar, uncomplicated company of his animals. He left her to face the house alone. From the dark mouth of the barn, he watched her. She stood for a long moment, looking at the dilapidated porch, the peeling paint, the suffocating silence that clung to the place like a shroud. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she stepped down from the wagon and walked to the front door. She pushed it open and disappeared inside. He had expected to feel some sense of relief, the first step of an imposition being lifted. Instead, a strange, disquieting tension settled in his chest. He had brought a new silence into his home, but this one was different. It was not empty. It was watchful. Inside, she moved through the rooms like a wraith. Dust motes danced in the slivers of fading light. A thick layer of grime covered every surface. In the main room, a rocking chair sat angled toward the cold hearth, a woman's shawl draped over its back, left as if she had only just stood up. On the mantel, a small, crudely carved wooden horse lay on its side. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers hovering over the toy before pulling back. She saw the geography of his pain mapped out in the abandoned objects, in the cold stillness of the air. This was not a house, it was a tomb. And she, in her veil, was just another spectre. She went to the small room at the back. It was bare, containing only a narrow bed with a thin mattress and a small washstand. It was more than she'd had. She set her small, bundled belongings on the floor and stood in the center of the room, her veiled head bowed. She did not weep. Tears were a luxury her life had not afforded her. She simply breathed in the scent of dust and disuse, and then she breathed out. And then, she began to work. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm of quiet labor. The ranch was an empire of unending tasks, and Silas lost himself in them. He rose with the first hint of gray light, his mind already on the broken fence line in the north pasture or the skittish colt that needed breaking. His hands, thick with calluses and scarred from wire and splinters, were instruments of toil. They gripped axes, twisted wire, held the trembling bodies of newborn livestock. They were strong, capable hands that knew only how to build and mend things of wood and earth. He found he could not mend himself. He began to notice the changes in the house not as single events, but as a slow, creeping tide of order. One evening, he came in to find the floor scrubbed clean, the wood gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Another day, the windows were washed, letting in a clarity of light that felt almost intrusive, too honest. The dust was gone. The air, which had been stale with stagnant grief, now smelled of soap and dried herbs. He would find his worn work shirts, previously ripped and frayed, laid on his bed with neat, almost invisible stitches closing the wounds in the fabric. He never saw her do these things. She moved through the house with a preternatural quietness, anticipating his schedule, his needs, and then vanishing before he returned. She was a ghost of a different sort, a ghost of competence, of care. He found meals left for him on the table, simple but nourishing. Stews, fresh bread, beans. Food that warmed him from the inside out, chasing away a chill he hadn't realized was bone deep. He ate alone, the silence of the room punctuated only by the scrape of his spoon against the bowl. He knew she was in her small room at the back of the house, likely eating her own solitary meal. He wondered about the veil. She never, ever removed it. He would catch glimpses of her from across the yard, a figure in a simple dress and the ever-present shawl covering her head and face, feeding the chickens or hanging laundry. The wind would press the fabric against the contours of her face, giving him a vague, unsettling impression of a chin, a nose, a mouth, but never the whole. It became a source of muted, gnawing curiosity. It was a lock without a key, a story with the first page torn out. His mind, seeking any distraction from his own pain, began to invent reasons. Was she disfigured? Was she hiding from someone? The questions were intruders in the ordered silence of his mind, and he resented them, yet he could not cast them out. One bitter evening, a month after her arrival, he returned from a long ride checking for strays along the mountain pass. A premature snow had begun to fall, thick, wet flakes that clung to his coat and melted down his neck. The wind had teeth, and it bit at his exposed skin. He was cold, weary, and his soul felt as raw as his chapped hands. He'd expected the cold, dark house. He'd expected to have to build a fire, his numb fingers fumbling with the kindling. Instead, when he pushed the door open, a wave of warmth met him. A fire was roaring in the hearth, its light dancing on the clean floorboards, casting away the menacing shadows that usually greeted him. The air smelled of roasting meat and coffee. On the table, a plate of food was waiting, steam rising from it in a gentle curl. By the fire, a tin mug of coffee sat on a small stool. She was nowhere to be seen. He stood there in the doorway, the snow melting from his hat and dripping onto the floor, and felt something shift inside him. It was a small, tectonic movement deep within the frozen landscape of his heart. It was the simple, profound shock of being cared for. He took off his coat and hung it by the door, walked to the table, and sat down. He ate the meal slowly. Every bite was an anchor, pulling him back into the present moment, into the warmth of the room. After he finished, he took the mug of coffee and sat in the rocking chair by the fire, the chair he had not touched since Sarah's death. He held the warm tin in his hands, letting the heat seep into his skin. The silence in the house was still there, but its character had changed. It was no longer the jagged, accusing silence of loss. It was softer. A shared quiet. He looked toward the back of the house, toward her closed door. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the still room. "Thank you," he said. The words felt foreign in his mouth, heavy and cumbersome. They hung in the air for a long moment, a clumsy offering. From behind the door, there was no reply. Only a beat of silence, and then the faintest rustle of movement, a small acknowledgement that he had been heard. And for Silas Blackwood, that was more than enough. It was a beginning. The ghosts of his past were not so easily banished. They were patient. They waited for the quiet of the night, for the moments when exhaustion failed to be a sufficient guard. One night, he dreamt of her. Not the veiled woman in his house, but Sarah. He dreamt of her laughter as they built the ranch together, the way the sun caught the gold in her hair. Then the dream soured, as it always did. He saw her face, pale with fever, her breath a shallow rasp. He saw his son, Thomas, small and still in his cot, the carved horse he'd made him clutched in his little hand. He awoke with a guttural cry lodged in his throat, his body drenched in a cold sweat. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, stealing his air. He threw off the blankets and stumbled out of the room, desperate for the biting night air to clear his head. He pulled on his boots and walked outside, not bothering with a coat. The moon was a silver shard in the inky sky, illuminating the ranch in a ghostly light. And then he saw her. She was standing by the small, fallow plot of earth beside the house. It had been Sarah's garden. It was now a square of dirt and dead weeds, a monument to his failure to keep life going. The veiled woman stood beside it, her hands clasped behind her back, her posture one of deep contemplation. She was a dark silhouette against the pale ground, as still and silent as a headstone. He stopped in the shadows of the porch, watching her. He should have felt anger, an invasion of his most private sorrow. That patch of ground was sacred, a place he could not bring himself to look at, let alone touch. But as he watched her, he felt a different emotion rise, something fierce and protective. He saw not an intruder, but a fellow exile. Her silence, he was beginning to understand, was not one of emptiness, but one that was crowded with its own ghosts, its own history. The veil was not just cloth, it was a fortress, and he wondered what sorrows it was built to keep out. He saw the slight slump of her shoulders and realized she was as haunted as he was. They were two solitary souls adrift in a sea of memory, their silences speaking to each other across the cold, moonlit yard. He retreated back into the house as quietly as he had come, the cold air having done its work. The sharp edges of his grief had been momentarily softened by the shared, unspoken burden of another's pain. The next morning, when Silas went out to the barn, he saw her. She was kneeling by the dead garden plot, a small, rusty trowel in her hand. She was methodically pulling the withered weeds, her movements economical and focused. He stopped, his hand on the barn door, and a protest rose in his throat. That was Sarah's garden. Every stone lining its border had been placed by his wife's hands. Every imagined bloom was a memory of her smile. To disturb it felt like a desecration. He took a step forward, the word stopped forming on his lips. But then he looked at her, at the determined set of her back, the steady purpose in her work. She was not erasing a memory, she was tending to a wound. She was bringing order to a small patch of chaos, just as she had done inside his house. The anger receded, replaced by a grudging respect. Life was a stubborn, persistent thing. It pushed up through scorched earth. It fought for the sun. He saw in her actions a resilience he feared he had lost entirely. He turned away without a word and went about his morning chores, his mind troubled. The sight of her working that soil stayed with him all day. It was a quiet challenge to his own stagnation. That evening, after he had eaten the meal she left for him, he walked to the tool shed. He found the good spade, its wooden handle worn smooth from his own father's hands. He picked up a sturdy watering bucket. He carried them over to the garden plot and set them down on the ground just beside the patch she had cleared. He did not say a word. He did not wait for her to see. He simply left them there, an offering placed on the altar of her quiet determination. It was his permission. It was his surrender. The next day, the spade was gone from where he'd left it, and a small section of the hard-packed earth had been turned over, dark and rich and full of promise. He looked at the freshly tilled soil and felt the first, tentative flicker of something he had long forgotten: hope. He had given her a patch of dead earth, and she was determined to make it live. Autumn bled into the prelude of winter. The days grew shorter, the wind sharpened its knives on the mountain peaks, and the sky took on the color of slate. One afternoon, the clouds gathered with a sudden, violent intensity. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-black, and the air grew heavy and still. A storm was coming, a bad one. Silas raced to secure the livestock, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was checking on a new mother in the birthing pen when the sky broke open. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The world dissolved into a fury of water and roaring wind. A bolt of lightning struck a nearby ridge, and the simultaneous crack of thunder shook the barn to its foundations. The animals panicked. The new calf, only a day old, was knocked from its feet and began to bleat in terror, struggling in the mud. Silas fought to calm its mother, his body soaked and his hands numb, the wind tearing the words from his mouth. He was losing the battle. The calf was weak, and the cold was setting in fast. In the chaos, he felt a presence at his side. He turned, startled, and saw her. She was holding a lantern high, the flame flickering widely inside its glass cage, casting a circle of defiant light in the maelstrom. Her veil was plastered to her face by the rain and wind, its mystery rendered moot by the urgency of the moment. She did not speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes, visible now as dark, focus points behind the soaked fabric, were fixed on the task at hand. She moved with him, a silent partner in the fight. When he needed a dry rag, her hand was there with one. When he needed to lift the shivering calf, she was there to help guide it, a surprising strength, a steady force against his own. They worked together as if they had done so for years, their movements synchronized, their purpose singular. They were a small island of order in a sea of chaos. They managed to get the calf onto a bed of dry hay under a solid part of the roof, rubbing it down until its shivering subsided. Finally, the small creature, exhausted but warm, nestled against its mother. The worst was over. The storm still raged outside, but inside the small circle of lantern light, a profound quiet fell. They stood side by side, breathing heavily, soaked to the bone, the smell of wet earth and rain filling the air. He looked at her, at the woman who had faced the storm without fear, and saw not a fragile, battered bride, but an anchor. The storm retreated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and trembling. The rain softened to a drizzle, and a fragile peace settled over the land. Back in the house, the fire in the hearth hissed and popped, a cheerful sound against the dripping from the eaves. Silas had given her a dry blanket, and she had disappeared into her room, emerging a few moments later in a dry dress, the veil replaced with a fresh, dry one. They stood on opposite sides of the hearth, wrapped in a silence that was no longer empty or awkward. It was charged, heavy with the unspoken events of the last hour. It was the silence after a battle, when the shared danger has forged a new kind of intimacy. Silas watched the firelight play over her shrouded form. He had seen her strength. He had felt her steady presence at his side when he needed it most. He had relied on her. And yet, he did not know her name. He did not know the face of the woman who was slowly, quietly, rebuilding his world. The veil, which had once been a matter of mild curiosity, was now an unbearable barrier. It stood between them, a symbol of all the questions he had never asked, all the history he did not know. He could no longer live with the mystery. It felt like a dishonesty, a cowardice. He turned from the fire to face her fully. The shadows in the room were deep, and her face was completely lost in the darkness of the shawl. He had to know. He needed to bridge the chasm of silence that had defined their existence. His own voice, when it came, was rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the wind and the weight of his own unspoken feelings. Why? The word was a stone dropped into a deep well. It was not just a question about the veil. It was a question about everything. Why was she sold for $5? Why was she guaranteed to be barren? Why did she stay? Why had she faced the storm? Why did she hide herself from the world, from him? The single word hung between them, a demand for truth in a house that had been built on secrets and sorrow. He waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Her posture did not change, but he sensed a new tension in her stillness, the bracing of a soul preparing for an old, familiar pain. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the drumming of his own blood in his ears. He thought perhaps she would refuse, that she would retreat back into the fortress of her silence and he would have to accept it. He had no right to ask, after all. Theirs was a contract, not a marriage. She was a housekeeper, not a confidant. Then, he saw her hands move. They were trembling, just slightly. Slowly, hesitantly, they rose toward her head. Her fingers fumbled for a moment at the knot tied beneath her chin. The gesture was one of immense vulnerability, like a soldier laying down their last shield. With a quiet intake of breath, she began to unwind the fabric. The shawl came away in her hands, falling into a soft pool of cloth at her feet. She lifted her chin and met his gaze. The firelight fell upon her face. Silas had prepared himself for anything. A burn. A birthmark. A disfigurement that would explain everything. What he saw stopped his breath. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty etched with sorrow. Her eyes were large and dark, holding a deep, weary sadness. Her mouth was firm, her jawline proud. And down her left cheek, from the corner of her eye to the edge of her lip, ran a thin, silver scar. It was not grotesque. It was a delicate line, a flaw that only served to highlight the fragile strength of her features. Then, she spoke. Her voice was low and soft, unused to filling a room. "My husband," she began, her words clipped, each one a carefully excavated stone. "He was not a kind man. He said my face was a temptation to others." She touched the scar with her fingertips, a fleeting, painful gesture. "This was his reminder that I belonged to him." She dropped her hand. "After he died, the town," they whispered. "The scar became a mark of shame. Of sin. The story that I was barren, it was a mercy, of a kind. A lie to make me undesirable. To make me invisible. It was the only way I could be free of that place." She finished, her gaze unwavering, her dignity a shield far stronger than any veil. She had laid her entire history at his feet, a broken, painful offering. Silas stood frozen, the truth of her words settling over him like a shroud. He looked at the scar, and he did not see shame. He saw a testament to survival. He saw the cruelty she had endured and the quiet courage it had taken for her to simply keep breathing. He finally understood the depth of her silence, the reason for her guardedness. Her veil had not been to hide her face from the world, but to protect her spirit from it. All the anger he had held onto, the bitterness over his own loss, seemed petty and small in the face of her quiet suffering. His grief had been loud, consuming the whole landscape of his life. Hers had been a silent, hidden burden. He felt a wave of protective fury, not at her, but at the world that had marked her so unfairly. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw past the housekeeper, past the mystery, and saw the woman herself. Ilara. Her name came to him then, though he had never heard it spoken. It felt right. It felt like her. He took a hesitant step closer. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders, the instinct of someone long accustomed to violence. He stopped immediately, his heart aching at the sight. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. Slowly, he reached out, not to touch her, but to hover his calloused, rough hand in the air a mere inch from her cheek. His fingers traced the line of the scar without making contact, a gesture of profound, aching tenderness. It was an acknowledgement of her wound, a promise that he would never add to it. He let his hand fall back to his side. He cleared his throat, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You're home, Ilara," he said. The name felt like a prayer on his tongue. It was the first time he had called her anything, and in that single word, he offered her everything he had, a sanctuary, a place of belonging. Her eyes, which had been guarded and weary, widened slightly. A flicker of disbelief, followed by a fragile, dawning hope. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her unscarred cheek. She did not wipe it away. The silence that fell between them now was new. It was not a silence of loneliness or secrets, but one of comprehension. Of beginning. Outside, the last of the rain whispered against the window panes. Inside, in the warm, flickering light of the fire, two solitary people, scarred by life in their own ways, had finally found the quiet promise of a shared horizon.